quiet of an Appalachian dawn is a fragile thing. It's a silence woven from mist and the slow breathing of the ancient mountains. On the morning of October 15th, 1998, in a forgotten fold of West Virginia known as Black Creek Hollow, that silence was torn to shreds by a single piercing scream. It was the sound of a world ending. The scream belonged to 17-year-old Abigail Miller, and it echoed through the hollow like a death knell, pulling neighbors from their beds, their faces etched with a familiar rural curiosity that was about to curdle into horror. They found the Miller family home in a state of gruesome stillness. The front door was ajar. Inside, the air was thick and metallic. Samuel Miller, the newlywed son and heir to the Miller name, was sprawled on the living room floor, a dark stain blossoming on his chest and a bloody gash on his temple. In the master bedroom, his parents, Jedediah and Martha Miller, lay in their bed, their bodies unnaturally rigid, a strange white foam crusted around their mouths. In a corner of the hallway, Abigail was huddled, her body racked with tremors, her eyes wide with a terror that had seen too much. And then there was Eleanor. They called her Ellie, the new bride, the 19-year-old girl from the other side of the ridge whose family was as poor as the Millers were rich. They found her in her own bedroom, her clothes disheveled, her face a mess of tears and dirt. She was babbling, her voice a thin, reedy whisper, telling a fractured story of masked men, of robbers who had burst into the house in the dead of night, their voices low and cruel, their hands swift and violent. She had survived, she sobbed, by hiding under the bed, listening to the muffled thuds and the terrible final silences. Sheriff Brody arrived as the sun was just beginning to burn the mist off the valley floor. He was a man carved from the same hard, unforgiving landscape as the hollow itself, his face a roadmap of 60 years of seeing the best and more often the worst of what people could be. He moved through the scene with a practiced, heavy calm, his presence a temporary dam against the rising tide of hysteria from the neighbors. He looked at the bodies, his expression grim. He looked at the shattered, trembling girl, Abigail, and then he looked at Ellie, the grieving widow, the fragile survivor, and his heart, a thing he usually kept locked away behind a wall of professional detachment, went out to her. This poor child, he thought, her new life destroyed before it had even begun. The story of a home invasion, a robbery gone wrong, seemed plausible enough in these hills, where old feuds simmered for generations and poverty could make desperate men do desperate things. The initial hours of the investigation were a chaotic swirl of flashing lights, yellow tape, and the low murmur of deputies taking statements. Ellie, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, repeated her story to Sheriff Brody. She was a convincing picture of grief and trauma. Her voice trembled. Her tears seemed genuine. She spoke of shadows, of rough hands, of a glint of metal in the moonlight. She was the perfect victim. The whispers among the assembled neighbors seemed to confirm the police's initial theory. The Millers were not well liked. Jedediah was known for his ruthless business dealings, for squeezing smaller farmers out of their land. He had enemies. This was revenge, they whispered, or a robbery. The Millers were the wealthiest family in the hollow. It made a kind of brutal, simple sense. But as the day wore on, as the bodies were zipped into black bags and taken away, as the initial shock began to subside, Brody felt the first faint prickle of unease. Something wasn't right. The story, as neat as it seemed, had frayed edges. He sat with Ellie again, in the quiet of her late in-law's kitchen, a place that now felt like a tomb. He asked her to go over the details one more time. How many men were there? What were they wearing? What did they say? Ellie's answers were still choked with sobs, but they were different this time. Before, she had said there were 3 men. Now she thought maybe it was 4. She had mentioned a shotgun. Now she wasn't sure. Maybe it was a handgun. She clutched her head, her body shaking. "I'm sorry, Sheriff," she cried. "I was so scared. It's all a blur." Brody nodded, his expression sympathetic. But in the back of his mind, a small, cold voice of doubt began to speak. The first seeds of Ellie's nightmare had been planted 6 months earlier, on a cool spring day that had felt more like a funeral than a wedding. She remembered standing in the small, clapboard church, the air thick with the smell of cheap perfume and mothballs, her hand cold and limp in Samuel Miller's sweaty grasp. He was a soft, doughy boy with a weak chin and eyes that never quite met hers. She felt nothing for him but a dull, empty pity. Her heart, her soul still belonged to Caleb Rivers. Caleb. The name was a ghost on her lips, a memory of a different life, a life of running barefoot through the woods, of stolen kisses by the creek, of a love that was as wild and real as the mountains themselves. But Caleb was poor. His family had nothing but a few acres of rocky soil and a name that carried no weight. And Ellie's family was just as poor. When Jedediah Miller had come calling with his cold eyes and his quiet, powerful offer, her father had seen a way out, a way to settle his debts, to ensure his own future. The price was his daughter. Ellie had been sold. She knew it the moment she stepped into the Miller house. It was a large, imposing farmhouse, but there was no warmth in it. The air was still and heavy like the air in a museum. It was a house of possessions, not of life, and she was to be its newest, most valuable acquisition. Her welcome was a baptism of ice. Martha Miller, a woman whose face seemed to be permanently pinched in a look of disapproval, had surveyed her from head to toe, her lips a thin, bloodless line. "She's pretty enough, I suppose," Martha had said to her husband, as if Ellie wasn't even in the room. "But she looks frail. Let's hope she's strong enough to give us a grandson." Jedediah had said nothing. He simply looked at her with his pale, watery eyes, a look of cold appraisal that made her feel like a piece of livestock being inspected at auction. And Samuel, her husband, had just stood there, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, a helpless, silent witness to her humiliation. In that moment, Ellie knew she had not just entered a new home. She had entered a gilded cage, a prison where the bars were made of wealth and tradition and a quiet, soul-crushing cruelty. The first few weeks were a blur of chores and criticisms. Martha was relentless. Ellie's cooking was too bland. Her cleaning was not thorough enough. She didn't mend Samuel's shirts properly. Every action was scrutinized, every flaw magnified. "Useless girl," Martha would mutter under her breath, just loud enough for Ellie to hear. "We take you in, give you a good home, and this is how you repay us? By being lazy, by being incompetent?" Jedediah's cruelty was of a different, more insidious kind. It was a cruelty of silence. He would sit at the dinner table, his presence a heavy, oppressive weight, and watch her. He never spoke to her directly, but she could feel his eyes on her, judging, disapproving. He treated her not as a daughter-in-law, but as an object, an unpaid servant whose only purpose was to serve his family and eventually to produce an heir. And Samuel. Oh, Samuel, he was the most profound disappointment of all. He was her husband. He was the one person who could have stood up for her, who could have offered a word of kindness, a moment of comfort. But he did nothing. He was a shadow of his parents. A weak-willed boy who was terrified of his father's silence and his mother's sharp tongue. At night, he would come to their bed and perform what he clearly saw as his husbandly duty. His touch was rough, impersonal, his breath sour with the smell of whiskey. For Ellie, it was a violation, a weekly reminder of her own powerlessness. Lying there in the darkness, feeling his weight on top of her, she would close her eyes and think of Caleb, and the seed of a cold, hard hatred began to take root in the barren soil of her heart. It was a hatred not just for the man on top of her, but for the entire family that had stolen her life. The investigation into the Miller family murders was going nowhere. The house had been a mess, contaminated by the well-meaning but clumsy neighbors who had rushed in to help. The crime scene techs found no usable footprints, no fingerprints that didn't belong to the family or the locals. There were no signs of forced entry. The story of a random home invasion was looking less and less likely. The hollow buzzed with speculation. Old man Miller had cheated someone in a land deal. He was mixed up with moonshiners. It was a professional hit. The theories were wild, and they led the police down a dozen different dead-end paths. Then, 2 days after the murders, the preliminary autopsy report came back, and it changed everything. The medical examiner confirmed that Samuel had died from a stab wound to the chest, and that he had a concussion from a blow to the head. But the cause of death for Jedediah and Martha was not so straightforward. There were no external injuries. The foaming at the mouth, the rigidity of their bodies all pointed to one thing: poison, a powerful, fast-acting neurotoxin. The lab would need more time to identify the specific substance, but the initial finding was undeniable. They had been poisoned. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was a calculated, intimate act of murder. The new evidence cast a different light on the whole case, and it cast a different light on the grieving widow. Sheriff Brody drove out to the Miller farm. He found Ellie sitting on the front porch swing, a lone, forlorn figure in black. He sat down next to her. He didn't want to accuse her. He just wanted to watch her. He told her about the poison. He watched her face carefully as he spoke. He saw the flicker of surprise in her eyes, quickly masked by a fresh wave of tears. "Poison," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Oh my God, those monsters! What kind of animals are they?" Her performance was flawless, but Brody had seen enough liars in his time to recognize the subtle tells, the way her eyes darted away for a split second, the way her hands, though trembling, were clenched into tight fists in her lap. The grief felt rehearsed. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Abigail Miller was beginning to emerge from the fog of her trauma. Her physical injuries were minor, but her mind was a shattered landscape. Her memories of that night were a jumble of disconnected images and sounds. But there was one thing she remembered with a chilling clarity: the soup. Ellie had made a special stew for dinner that night, a thick, hearty rabbit stew. She had been so insistent that everyone have some. "It's a new recipe," Ellie had said, her smile seeming a little too bright, a little too fixed. Abigail remembered the taste. It was strange. There was a bitter, pungent aftertaste, a chemical tang that had made her feel slightly nauseous. She'd only eaten a few spoonfuls. Her parents and her brother had eaten whole bowls. She remembered Ellie watching them, her eyes wide and unblinking. Abigail's fragmented memory was the key. Armed with this new information, Sheriff Brody got a warrant for a second, more thorough search of the Miller house. This time, his team knew what they were looking for. They weren't looking for signs of a break-in. They were looking for the source of the poison. For hours, they meticulously combed through the house, the kitchen, the pantry, the basement. They found nothing. Then a young deputy searching the old, dilapidated storage shed out back found it. Tucked away behind a stack of old, moldy firewood was a small glass bottle. It was a bottle of a powerful pesticide, the kind used to kill coyotes and other predators. It was nearly empty. The deputy unscrewed the cap and sniffed. The smell was sharp, chemical, and sickeningly familiar. It was the same smell Abigail had described. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture of unimaginable cruelty. Sheriff Brody sat across from Ellie in the stark, windowless interrogation room at the county jail. The bottle of pesticide was on the metal table between them. He told her about Abigail's memory of the soup. He told her about the bottle they had found in the shed. Ellie's facade, the carefully constructed mask of the fragile, grieving widow, began to crack. The tears came again, but this time they seemed frantic, desperate. She concocted a new story, a wild, improbable tale. The masked men, she sobbed, had found her hiding. They had dragged her to the kitchen, held a knife to her throat, and forced her to add a strange powder from a small bag into the stew. They had threatened to kill her if she didn't obey. It was a good story for a moment. It explained the poison. It explained her survival. But it was a story riddled with holes. Brody began to pick it apart, his questions calm, relentless. "Why, Ellie? Why would they do that? Why would a group of robbers in the middle of a home invasion take the time to poison the family? Why not just shoot them? And why would they force you to do it? Why not just do it themselves? And the most important question of all, Ellie, why would they leave a witness?" Ellie had no answers. Her lies became more tangled, more contradictory. She was drowning in her own deception. Then came the final, irrefutable blows. The full toxicology report came back from the state lab. It confirmed the presence of the pesticide in the bodies of all 3 victims. But it also revealed something else. The concentration of the poison was highest not in the leftover stew, but in Jedediah's personal teapot and in the bottle of whiskey that Samuel had been drinking from that night. This was not a single, spontaneous act of poisoning a communal meal. This was a targeted attack. The killer had deliberately poisoned each victim individually, ensuring a lethal dose. And then, the forensics team delivered the final, damning piece of evidence. The fingerprints on the pesticide bottle were a perfect match for Eleanor Vance Miller. The investigation into Ellie's past uncovered a hidden chapter of her life. Her grandmother, a woman known in the Hollow as a granny woman, had been a local healer, a practitioner of folk medicine. She had an extensive knowledge of the local flora, of the plants that could cure, and the plants that could kill. As a young girl, Ellie had been her apprentice. She had spent years learning about the properties of herbs and roots, about the delicate balance between medicine and poison. She knew about things like water hemlock and foxglove, plants that grew wild in the hills and could kill a man with just a few leaves. This quiet, seemingly simple girl had a secret, deadly knowledge. In the interrogation room, under the relentless pressure of Brody's questioning, the full monstrous truth finally came out. In a chilling, emotionless confession, Ellie admitted to experimenting with the pesticide. For weeks leading up to the murders, she had been testing it on the farm animals, a few drops in the chicken's water, a little more in the dog's food. She had been methodically, scientifically determining the lethal dosage, the time it would take to work. She was not just a killer, she was a meticulous, patient chemist of death. And then she revealed the most horrifying detail of all. She admitted that she had deliberately given Abigail a smaller, non-lethal dose of the poison. It was not an act of mercy. It was an act of pure, cold calculation. She needed a living witness, a witness who was genuinely terrified, who could corroborate her story of the masked robbers. Abigail's survival was not an accident. It was a crucial part of her perfect, diabolical plan. The final confession was not a flood of remorse, but a cold, hard, unrepentant statement. Sheriff Brody, in a last-ditch effort to find a flicker of humanity in the girl sitting across from him, had brought her parents into the room. He had even mentioned Caleb's name, hoping to appeal to the memory of the love she had lost. And for a moment, it seemed to work. The mention of Caleb, the sight of her parents' tear-streaked faces, seemed to break through her icy composure. She broke down, her body convulsing with sobs. She confessed to everything. But the tears were not tears of regret, they were tears of rage. As she spoke, her voice transformed. The frightened whimper was gone, replaced by a low, venomous hiss. She recounted in graphic detail the months of abuse and humiliation she had endured. She described the cold, dead feeling of her husband's touch. She mimicked the shrewish, cutting tone of her mother-in-law's voice. She described the suffocating weight of her father-in-law's silent judgment. "They treated me like I was nothing," she spat, her eyes burning with a cold fire. "They treated me like dirt, like an animal, so I killed them like animals." She described their deaths with a chilling detachment, how she had watched Martha gasp and clutch at her throat, how Jedediah had simply slumped forward into his teacup, and how she had waited until the poison had weakened Samuel before she had approached him from behind and plunged a kitchen knife into his chest, a final, personal act of retribution for the nights of violation she had endured. The trial was a sensation. The story of the Harvest Bride, the beautiful young woman who had slaughtered her new family, was headline news across the state. In the courtroom, Ellie was a different person. The fragile, broken girl was gone. In her place was a woman of unnerving calm and composure. She sat through the testimony, her expression unreadable. She reenacted the crime for the jury with precise, emotionless movements, as if she were demonstrating a recipe. When she was on the stand, she looked directly at Abigail, who was huddled in the front row, a ghost of her former self. And Ellie smiled. It was a small, knowing smile, a smile of shared secrets and terrible triumph. Her final words to the court, before the judge sentenced her to death, were not a plea for mercy. They were a declaration of victory. "I don't regret it," she said, her voice clear and steady. "They deserved to die. Now I'm finally free." She turned her gaze back to Abigail. "You live," she said, her voice a soft, chilling whisper. "You live and remember the faces of the people who did this to me." The experts who evaluated her spoke of antisocial personality disorder, of a profound lack of empathy, of a cunning intelligence hidden behind a mask of vulnerability. But for the people of Black Creek Hollow, the explanation was much simpler. Ellie Vance was not just a woman, she was a monster, a demon in the shape of a girl. The aftermath was a landscape of ruin. Ellie's parents, broken by shame and grief, sold their land and moved away, disappearing into the anonymity of a distant city. Caleb Rivers, the boy she had loved, fell into a spiral of drink and despair, his life forever haunted by the ghost of the girl he thought he knew. Abigail Miller, the sole survivor, suffered a complete mental breakdown. She was institutionalized, her mind a permanent prisoner of that terrible night. She never returned to Black Creek Hollow, and the Miller farmhouse, the site of the massacre, was left to rot. It was abandoned, its windows dark and empty like the eyes of a skull. It became a place of local legend, a haunted house where the ghosts of a murdered family were said to wander, their silence a testament to the horror that had unfolded within its walls. Years later, long after he had retired, Sheriff Brody would sometimes sit on his front porch, looking out at the mountains that cradled Black Creek Hollow. He would think about the case, about the beautiful, fragile girl who had been capable of such monstrous, calculated evil. He was a man who believed in the simple dichotomy of good and evil, but the case of Eleanor Miller had blurred those lines into a terrifying, incomprehensible gray. He wondered if the monster had been born of her suffering, a twisted creation of the cruelty she had endured, or had it always been there, lurking just beneath the surface of her pretty, placid face, just waiting for a reason to be set free. He never found an answer, and the silence that had returned to Black Creek Hollow was no longer a peaceful thing. It was a heavy, watchful silence, a silence that remembered the screams and the terrible final quiet that had followed.